The night Oliver Finley read a bedtime story was the night the entire town of Caldwell, Kansas stopped breathing. They had gathered outside the windows of the Merriweather boarding house like moths drawn to an impossible flame, ranch hands with their hats pressed to their chests, the blacksmith with soot still on his forearms, Widow Cassidy dabbing her eyes with a flour-dusted apron. None of them could explain later why they had come. Perhaps they had heard the soft, low cadence of a voice that had never before spoken anything, except ultimatums and warnings. Perhaps they had sensed, the way animals sense a change in weather, that something enormous was shifting in the fabric of the world they knew. Inside, Oliver Finley sat on the edge of a narrow bed in the pale yellow light of a kerosene lamp, a small worn book open across his calloused palms. His holster hung on the bedpost. His long coat was draped over the chair, and the child nestled beneath the quilt watched him with enormous eyes as if she, too, could not entirely believe what was happening. But none of that was what made Augusta Merriweather press her hand over her mouth and lean against the doorframe as if her legs had forgotten how to hold her. What broke her open was not the reading itself. It was the voice. Oliver Finley, the man every soul in Caldwell had decided was carved from stone and shadow, the man whose name was spoken in low tones, and whose reputation for silence was matched only by his reputation for being absolutely lethal, was reading in a voice so gentle it sounded like it belonged to a different man entirely. A man who had once, in some buried life, known what it meant to be loved. Augusta had spent 3 weeks convinced that Oliver Finley was her enemy, her captor, her dark obligation. She had been wrong. She had been catastrophically wrong, and standing there in that doorway, she felt the full weight of that wrongness crash through her like a river breaking through a dam. She did not know yet that by morning, everything would be different. She did not know that Oliver carried a secret that would either destroy them both or save them. She did not know that the man who had ridden into her life like a thunderstorm on a clear day was about to become the only shelter she had ever truly needed. But she was beginning to suspect it, and that suspicion terrified her more than any gun. 3 weeks earlier, Augusta Merriweather had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas on the Santa Fe Railway line with $14, a carpet bag, a letter of introduction, and the absolute certainty that she was walking into the worst mistake of her life. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, gray-eyed, stubborn as hard-pan soil after a long drought, and recently in possession of a dead husband who had left her with his debts, his boarding house, and absolutely nothing else. The boarding house, it turned out, sat in Caldwell, a cattle town at the edge of the Cherokee Strip that was politely described in the railway pamphlets as thriving and less politely described by everyone who had ever been there, as a place where trouble came to set down roots. The year was 1882. Caldwell was technically in Kansas, but it sat so close to Indian territory that the law was a suggestion more than a guarantee. The cattle trade had made it prosperous and violent in equal measure. Texas drovers came through in great dusty waves every summer, and the saloons on Main Street never truly closed, and the marshal's office changed hands with unsettling frequency. Augusta had not chosen Caldwell. Caldwell had been chosen for her by a dead man named Harold Merriweather, whom she had married at 22 in Cincinnati because he had seemed reliable, and because being reliable had seemed, at the time, like enough. It had not been enough. Harold had been secretly drowning in debt for years, borrowing against the boarding house, making promises he had no intention of keeping, and when his heart gave out over a plate of salt pork in the spring of 1882, Augusta had discovered that she was not so much a widow as she was the inheritor of a catastrophe. She had 2 choices: sell the boarding house to pay the debts and have nothing left, or go to Caldwell, run the house herself, and find a way to make it work. She had chosen the second option not because she was brave, but because she had no talent for surrender. The boarding house on 2nd Street was a 2-story clapboard building with a wraparound porch and 6 rooms for rent and a kitchen that smelled permanently of wood smoke and coffee. It had 3 tenants when Augusta arrived, all of them men. A traveling grain merchant named Plotz who was never sober after noon, a young cowboy from Texas named Ames who was never sober before noon, and in the corner room at the end of the upstairs hall, a man named Oliver Finley who paid his rent 3 months in advance in gold coin, and who the previous tenants had described, in whispered warning, as someone you simply did not bother. Augusta had looked at the gold coin and decided to bother him anyway. She had knocked on his door that first evening with a list of house rules she had written on the train, because if she was going to run a boarding house in a violent cattle town, she was going to run it with some semblance of order. The man who opened the door was not what she expected, which was to say he was exactly what she expected in the worst possible way. Oliver Finley was 32 years old and built like someone had designed him specifically to be intimidating. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that suggested he had never in his life made a decision he regretted. He had pale green eyes, which was the one feature that did not fit the rest of the composition, eyes that were unexpectedly careful, observant in a way that felt almost scientific. He wore a Colt single-action army revolver on his hip as naturally as other men wore suspenders. He looked at Augusta's list of house rules. He looked at Augusta. He said nothing for a long moment. "No discharging firearms inside the building," Augusta said, because silence had never intimidated her. "No alcohol brought onto the premises after 10 o'clock at night. No guests in rooms without prior notification to the house manager, which is me. Meals are at 7, noon, and 6. If you miss a meal, you feed yourself. These are not negotiable." Oliver Finley studied her with those careful green eyes. Then he said in a voice so quiet she had to pay attention to hear it, "I don't drink after 10. "Good," Augusta said. "I don't bring guests." "Better. The firearm doesn't leave my person." Augusta considered this for a moment. "Then don't discharge it inside the building." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile but the ghost of one, there, and gone so fast she almost missed it. He took the list from her hand, glanced at it once more, and handed it back. "I'll be no trouble to you, Mrs. Merriweather." "See that you aren't," she said, and went back downstairs, and spent the rest of the evening wondering why her hands were slightly unsteady. She learned who he was by accident, the way you learn most dangerous things. She overheard it in the general store 3 days after her arrival, 2 men talking in low, urgent voices about how the Caldwell law had brought in Oliver Finley to deal with a problem, the same way you call a doctor when ordinary medicines have stopped working. He was a hired gun, they said, though not the mercenary kind precisely. He had a reputation that went ahead of him like his own shadow. Bounty hunter, contract enforcer, the man you called when the situation had moved beyond the reach of ordinary resolution. He had killed men. That part was spoken so matter-of-factly it turned Augusta's stomach cold. She went home and stood in her kitchen and thought about the gold coin and the quiet voice and the almost smile, and she thought about how the world was not, unfortunately, arranged according to anyone's preferences. Then she made supper and set his plate at the table the same as always, because he paid his rent and he followed the rules, and he had done nothing to warrant being treated otherwise. That was the only position she could afford to hold. The trouble began not with Oliver but with a man named Cutter Hobbs. Hobbs was the primary creditor who had purchased Harold's debt, a land speculator from Wichita with a reputation in financial circles that was only slightly less alarming than Oliver's reputation in other circles. He arrived in Caldwell in the 2nd week of August, 2 weeks after Augusta, and he came to the boarding house not to stay, but to inform Augusta that Harold had taken out a secondary loan she had not known about, secured against the property itself, and that the repayment schedule was going to begin immediately. Augusta sat across from Cutter Hobbs in her own parlor and felt the trap close around her ankles. She could not pay what he was asking on the boarding house's current income. He knew that. He was smiling the way men smile when they have already decided how a situation is going to end, and their only remaining pleasure is watching the other person realize it. "You have 30 days, Hobbs said pleasantly, after which the property reverts to the note holder, which would be me." After he left, Augusta sat very still in the parlor for a long time. She was not a woman who cried easily, or if she did, she preferred to do it in private. She was calculating, which is what she did instead of panicking. She was calculating how much the rooms could bring in at capacity, what corners she could cut, whether there was any possibility at all of meeting Hobbs's demand within 30 days. The numbers did not cooperate. She was still sitting there when Oliver Finley came downstairs from his room, presumably heading for the back door on one of his inexplicable evening walks. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her face and then at the papers spread across the table. "Hobbs came," he said. It was not quite a question. Augusta looked up sharply. "You know him." "I know of him." Oliver's voice had that same quiet precision it always had, each word placed as deliberately as a card on a table. "He's bought up 9 properties in the last 2 years by the same method, obscure secondary notes, compacted repayment windows." Augusta felt something cold and specific settle in her chest. "He does this often enough that he's good at it." She looked at the papers. Then she looked at Oliver. "Why are you telling me this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you should know what you're dealing with." That was all. He went out the back door, and Augusta sat with the information as if it were a coal, hot and useful and potentially dangerous. What she did not ask herself, because she was not ready for the answer, was why the knowledge that Oliver Finley was paying attention to her situation made her feel, beneath the fear, something that was uncomfortably close to relief. The days that followed were a gauntlet of small crises and larger ones. Augusta worked from before dawn until after dark, cleaning rooms and cooking meals and doing the accounts and attempting, through sheer force of will, to manifest solutions from arithmetic that refused to add up in her favor. She wrote to Harold's solicitor in Cincinnati. She wrote to the county land office in Wichita. She wrote 3 letters she never sent because halfway through composing them she realized they were just versions of asking for help, and she had not yet decided she was that desperate. She also, in the spaces between crises, became unavoidably aware of Oliver Finley. Not in the way she wanted to be aware of him, not in any comfortable or easily dismissed way, but in the way that happens when someone is frequently present in a small space and turns out to be entirely different from what their reputation suggested. He was quiet, yes. He was private, absolutely. But he was not unkind. He fixed a broken porch step one morning without being asked, just appeared with a hammer and planks, and did it before she came out with coffee. He returned the grain merchant Plots to his room one night when Plots had drunk himself into incoherence in the kitchen, managed it with such complete lack of drama that Plots remembered nothing in the morning. He never left messes. He never demanded anything. He said please and thank you with the automatic correctness of someone who had been very carefully taught manners and had held on to them through whatever came after. Augusta found herself learning his rhythms without intending to. She knew he was awake before dawn. She knew he took coffee black. She knew he sat on the back porch on evenings when the wind came from the south because he liked the smell of the prairie grass at night, which was the kind of specific personal preference she had no business cataloging about a man who was not her business. She told herself it was practical. You needed to know your tenants. She told herself this firmly and often, and only occasionally believed it. The child arrived on a Thursday in the 3rd week of August, and she arrived the way most catastrophes arrive, unexpectedly and with no regard for timing. Her name was Lily. She was 5 years old. She arrived at the back door of the boarding house in the company of a Caldwell woman named Mrs. Prout, who was breathless and clearly at the end of her charitable patience, carrying Lily on her hip the way you carry something you dearly need to set down. "She's Oliver Finley's ward," Mrs. Prout announced. The The wagon she was traveling on had an accident coming up from the territory. The woman who was minding her broke her arm. The child has been asking for Mr. Finley by name. I was told he stays here." Augusta looked at the child. Lily had dark eyes and a cut on her chin from the accident, and she was clutching a small stuffed rabbit with the desperate grip of someone who had recently lost several things and was not willing to lose one more. She was not crying. That particular quality of dignity in a small frightened face was, Augusta thought, almost unbearable. "Come inside," Augusta said. She got Lily cleaned up, and the cut tended and sat her at the kitchen table with milk and cornbread. And then she went to the foot of the stairs and called Oliver's name in a voice that was steady and informative rather than alarmed, because alarming the man who slept with a revolver on his bedpost seemed inadvisable. He came downstairs in 30 seconds. He took one look at Lily and something happened in his face that Augusta had never seen before, a breaking open, a kind of desperate relief so raw it transformed him entirely. "Lily," he said. "Oliver," Lily said, with the gravity of a small person who has been frightened and is now pretending she wasn't. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides and crouched down to her level and said, "Are you hurt?" with an urgency that made Augusta's chest feel strange. Lily showed him the cut on her chin with considerable pride. He examined it with the same precision he gave to everything and then said, quietly, "You're all right." "I know," Lily said. The lady fixed it. Oliver looked up at Augusta with an expression she could not fully interpret, gratitude, and something more complicated layered underneath it. "Thank you. She needs supper and sleep," Augusta said. "The rest can wait." It came out that evening in fragments, the way complicated things come out when a private man is confronted with a situation too large to maintain silence around. Oliver had been the guardian of Lily since her mother's death 9 months earlier. Her mother had been his sister. She had died of pneumonia in Indian Territory the previous winter, which was where she had been living with her husband, a horse trader. The husband had died the summer before that. Lily was the only surviving member of that particular branch of Oliver Finley's family, and Oliver had been providing for her care through a woman in the territory who had been her mother's friend. He told Augusta this in the kitchen after Lily had fallen asleep, sitting across the table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and Augusta heard not just the facts but the dark past underneath them, the weight of loss that a man like Oliver would carry without complaint and without company, because asking for help was not something he had apparently ever learned to do. She also heard something he did not say directly, which was that Lily could not be left in Indian Territory with a woman who now had a broken arm, and that there was no arrangement yet made, and that Oliver Finley was, beneath the competence and the silence and the fearsome reputation, genuinely terrified of failing this child. "She can stay here," Augusta said. Oliver looked up. "The house has a room. I have no use for a 6th paying tenant." Augusta kept her voice practical. "She won't be any trouble, will she?" "No," Oliver said. "She's a very quiet child." Then it's settled. She did not examine too closely why she had made that offer so readily. She told herself it was the same calculation she always ran. What was useful, what was manageable, what cost she could afford. She did not look at how the expression on Oliver Finley's face when she said those words had felt like something she would carry for a long time. The next morning, the situation with Cutter Hobbs escalated. He came to the house again, this time with a man from the county land office, and a document that had been notarized and looked very official, and suggested that the repayment window had, due to a clause Augusta had not seen in the original paperwork, been compressed from 30 days to 15. Augusta stood on her own porch and read the document and understood that Hobbs was not in Caldwell to negotiate. He was in Caldwell to take the boarding house, and he had structured the situation so that legal resistance would be slow and expensive and almost certainly arrive after the deadline. She said, very calmly, that she would review the document with counsel. Hobbs smiled and said that was entirely her prerogative. She went inside and stood in the hallway for a moment, and the word that moved through her was not any of the practical ones. The word was betrayal, specific and sharp, because Harold had done this to her, had hidden this from her for years, and the anger at a dead man felt useless and enormous and had nowhere to go. Oliver was in the hallway behind her. He had seen Hobbs on the porch. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She heard herself telling him and realized she was not angry at him for listening, was in fact relieved by it, which was its own kind of revelation. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Hobbs is operating in a gray area," Oliver said. "The compressed clause depends on a specific interpretation of Kansas property law that a county judge might not uphold. But you'd need to file for an injunction to keep him from moving on the property while the case was argued." Augusta stared at him. "How do you know that?" He was quiet for a beat. "I've dealt with men like Hobbs before, not always on the side of the law." It was the first time he had acknowledged directly what he was, what he had been. Augusta heard it and felt the weight of it, felt how it was offered, not as a confession exactly, but as a form of honesty, telling her the truth about himself without the softening she had not asked for. "You have a dark past," she said, "not an accusation, a recognition." "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. "Can you help me navigate it? The Hobbs situation." Something moved in those careful green eyes. "I can try." What followed was 7 days of a different kind of fight than any Augusta had expected, a legal and strategic fight conducted in letters and appearances at the county office and conversations, with a Caldwell attorney named Farwell who had a reputation for diligence if not brilliance. Oliver knew which pressure to apply and where, knew which officials responded to what kind of approach, knew, in short, how the machinery of a frontier legal dispute worked because he had moved through it many times from many directions. He used that knowledge now on her behalf without being asked to explain it further. Augusta watched him and revised her understanding of who he was. Not a simple man, not a monster, despite the reputation. A man who had learned to survive in a world that did not offer him many legitimate options, and who had made choices that he had clearly not made lightly, and who was now doing something that looked, from a certain angle, very much like trying to make things right. They talked, during those 7 days, more than either of them had apparently talked to anyone in years. It happened naturally, over the kitchen table in the evenings after Lily was in bed, going over documents and strategies, and then somehow beyond them, into territory that had nothing to do with Hobbs or property law. Augusta talked about Harold, more than she had intended to, the slow, cold disappointment of a marriage to a man who was reliably present and reliably absent in every way that mattered. Oliver talked about his sister, carefully, and with the particular precision of someone handling something fragile. He talked about the territory. He talked about a childhood in Missouri that had contained very little gentleness and had ended, in practical terms, when he was 17 and went to work as a livestock guard on cattle trails. He did not talk about the killing. She did not ask. There were some things that needed to be acknowledged rather than examined, and she was developing a sense for which things were which. Lily was a constant in these evenings, at least until bedtime. The child had settled into the boarding house with the adaptability of the very young, with a speed that suggested she had spent her short life learning to find solid ground wherever it presented itself. She followed Augusta around the kitchen with grave interest. She showed Oliver her rabbit, whose name was apparently Clover, with the formality of a formal introduction. She asked questions with the relentless precision of a child who understood that information was useful and who had decided that both of these adults were safe to ask. Augusta loved her almost immediately, which was alarming. It was the kind of love that arrived without negotiation, sudden and total, and it sat in her chest like a coal, warm and slightly dangerous. She noticed Oliver watching her with Lily sometimes. In the evenings, watching the way Augusta helped Lily with her supper, or combed out her hair, or listened to the elaborate and largely fictional stories Lily told about Clover the rabbit's adventures. He watched with an expression that was not quite readable, but that Augusta was beginning to learn to interpret. That particular quality of stillness in his face that was not coldness but its opposite, something held very carefully because he did not know what to do with it. She had almost kissed him on the 5th day, standing in the kitchen doorway with a lamp in her hand after checking on Lily. He had come up behind her and she had turned, and they had been approximately 4 inches apart in the narrow doorway, and she had seen in his face the same precise shock she felt, the same recognition, and then they had both stepped back, and the moment had been acknowledged and bypassed with a thoroughness that required almost physical effort. She had stood at her window for a long time afterward. On the 8th day, Hobbs made a different move. He came not to the house and not to the county office but to the saloon on Main Street, where he met with 2 men from Texas and had a conversation that was, according to Plotz, who had been present in his professional capacity as a man who was always in saloons, about pressure, physical pressure, the kind applied to people rather than documents. Augusta heard this from Plotz the following morning and felt the stakes shift under her feet. This was no longer a legal contest. This was a trap. Hobbs had decided that the legal route was moving too slowly and was now considering other methods. And the other methods, in Caldwell in 1882, came with revolvers and specific vocabularies. She told Oliver. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "He's escalating because the injunction is working," Oliver said finally. "Farwell's argument about the clause is stronger than Hobbs expected." "That doesn't make me feel better right now," Augusta said. "It shouldn't." Oliver looked at her directly, that flat, precise gaze. "This is the part where you need to decide whether you trust me." Augusta looked back at him. She was aware of everything at once: the lamp on the table between them, the sound of Lily breathing in the room above, the particular quality of this moment as something that would either become a foundation or a fracture. "I trust you," she said. She meant it. That was the astonishing part. She had not expected to mean it. Oliver did something then. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers for just a moment, just 1 second of warmth and certainty, and then he withdrew it and said, "All right. Let me take care of Hobbs." What he did was not violent. She had expected something violent, had braced for it, had tried to decide how she felt about it in advance. What Oliver actually did was more elegant and considerably more devastating. He apparently had, in the course of his particular career, accumulated information about a number of men operating in the gray areas of the Kansas and Territory economies. He went to visit Hobbs at the hotel that evening and had a private conversation that lasted 20 minutes. Augusta did not know what was said. She suspected it involved Hobbs's activities in the past 2 years and possibly the specific attention of federal authorities and possibly other information whose provenance she preferred not to examine closely. What she knew was the result, which was that Cutter Hobbs left Caldwell on the morning train the following day, and that a letter arrived at the county land office 2 days later withdrawing his claim on the Merriweather property. Augusta stood in the land office with the letter in her hand and felt the particular dizzying relief of a trap springing open. She went home and found Oliver on the porch and said, "It worked." He said, "Good." She said, "Thank you," and because 2 words seemed entirely inadequate for what he had done, she stood there on her own porch in the September afternoon light and tried to find the ones that were adequate and failed, and instead just looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the space between them was full of everything they had not yet said. "Lily has been asking about the stars," Oliver said finally, which was not what she expected. "She wants to know their names." Augusta felt something warm and completely unexpected move through her. "Does she?" "I told her I didn't know them." He paused. "You might." "Some of them," Augusta said. That night after supper, the 3 of them sat on the back porch with a blanket over Lily and the Kansas sky laid out above them like a question. And Augusta named what she knew, Orion and Cassiopeia, and the fixed reliable point of the North Star. and Lily asked follow-up questions with her characteristic gravity, and Oliver sat beside Augusta close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his arm, and said nothing at all, but listened with the focused attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. Augusta thought about how she had arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks ago certain she was walking into the worst mistake of her life. She was revising that assessment significantly. The change between them did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened in accumulation, the way rivers cut through stone, not by force but by persistence. A hand passed near a hand in the kitchen. Eyes met over Lily's dark head and held a beat too long. Conversations that had begun as practical and turned into something else without either of them steering deliberately toward it. He told her one evening about the last time he had been in a church, which was at his sister's funeral, and he told it with a plainness that was more affecting than sentiment would have been. He said he had not been able to cry at the service, not because he did not feel it, but because he had spent so many years training himself against that particular expression, and that he had stood at the grave afterward, alone, and the inability to release it had felt like another kind of wound. Augusta did not say anything immediately. Then she said, "Grief doesn't require an audience." He looked at her. "You don't have to perform it to prove it's real," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I know that. I'm still learning it." She thought about her own grief, the gray quiet years with Harold, the way she had quietly stopped expecting things and told herself that was wisdom rather than defeat, and how similar that was to what he was describing, a different kind of wound shaped exactly the same way. "I think," she said carefully, "that some of us spend a great deal of time teaching ourselves not to need things, and then we have to unlearn that, which is harder." Oliver looked at her with those careful green eyes for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it is." She felt, in that moment, seen in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt it like warmth, like something physical moving through her. She was falling in love with Oliver Finley. She had suspected it. Now she knew it, with the specific clarity of something you have been avoiding looking at directly and then suddenly cannot look away from. The question was what to do about it, which was complicated by approximately everything. He was a man who had killed people, though she was increasingly certain those killings had not been casual, and many of them had operated on the right side of whatever moral line he held himself to. He was a man whose life was not arranged for staying anywhere. He was a man who was, at least until some different arrangement was made, responsible for a 5-year-old child who needed stability more than she needed anything else. And Augusta herself was a woman 6 months widowed who owned a boarding house in a cattle town, and whose entire financial existence depended on her ability to keep that house running, and who had no business falling in love with her most complicated tenant. She held all of this in mind like stones in a pocket, and went on making meals and filing paperwork with Farwell and teaching Lily to identify the letters of the alphabet, and said nothing directly about any of it. It was Lily who forced the question, which was perhaps inevitable, because Lily was 5 and had not yet learned to avoid the direct approach. She had been sick. It was nothing serious, a child's fever that comes fast and runs high and breaks by morning, but the night of it was a hard one. Augusta sat with her through the worst of it, cool cloth on her forehead, speaking softly. Oliver had come to the doorway and stayed there, too alarmed to be useful but unable to leave, and Augusta had looked up at him once and said, "She's all right," and watched him breathe again. By 10 o'clock the fever had peaked and begun to ease. Lily, exhausted and half delirious and showing the particular irrationality of a sick child who is almost well, began to ask for a story. Augusta reached for the lamp and looked around the room. There was a small book on the shelf that had come with the furnished room, an old collection of fairy stories, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed. She picked it up and opened it. "There's a book here," she said. "Shall we try it?" Lily looked at the book. Then she looked at Oliver in the doorway. "Him," she said, with the clarity of a child who has decided. Augusta looked at Oliver. He looked at Lily. He looked at the book. He looked like a man confronting something he was not equipped for and was going to attempt anyway. He came into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed. He took the book that Augusta held out to him, and he looked at the page for a moment, and then he began to read. His voice was low and careful and completely transformed. Augusta stood in the doorway and listened to Oliver Finley read about a princess in a silver tower, and a knight who had lost his way and was finding it again through love. And she understood that she was hearing something that was true not just as a story. She pressed her hand over her mouth because she was crying quietly, and she did not want Lily to hear it and be alarmed. Outside the window, as she would learn later, Caldwell had gathered. The word had spread in the mysterious way that small-town words spread, and people had come quietly to stand in the dark and listen to a gunslinger read a bedtime story in a gentle voice, and none of them said anything because there was nothing adequate to say. The story was brief. By the time Oliver finished the last page, Lily was asleep. He sat for a moment without moving, looking at her face. Then he stood and turned and found Augusta still in the doorway and saw her face. He crossed the room. He stopped very close to her. "Augusta," he said, just her name in that same voice, the one she had not known existed until tonight. "I know," she said. It was not a complete sentence, but it was the most honest thing she had ever said to him. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, that calloused, capable hand that had done things she did not want to think about too closely tonight. And the touch was so careful it felt like a question. She answered it by leaning into his palm. They stayed like that for a long moment in the doorway with Lily sleeping behind them and the sound of Caldwell going quiet outside. And Augusta felt something in her that had been very tightly wounded beginning, finally, to release. He kissed her later, downstairs in the kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the house quiet around them. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was a very honest one. Slow and certain, the kind that arrives not as a beginning but as a confirmation of something that has been true for a while. When he lifted his head, he looked at her steadily and said, "I need to tell you some things." "I know," she said, "some of them are not good. I know that too." They sat down at the kitchen table, which was where all their most important conversations seemed to happen, and he told her. He told her about the years on the cattle trails, the escalation from livestock guard to enforcement work, the first time he had been asked to do something that crossed a line, and the fact that he had done it because he was 23 and hungry, and the world had not arranged itself conveniently around his moral preferences. He told her about the progression of it, how one compromise created the landscape for the next, how he had eventually found himself operating in territories that were not gray so much as very dark, working for men whose purposes he did not fully examine because examination had started to feel like a luxury. He told her about the moment it had stopped. He told her about a man in Indian Territory, a rancher whose land was being disputed, and how Oliver had been hired to resolve the dispute, and had arrived to find that the dispute involved not just land but a family being forced from it, and how he had looked at the situation and understood clearly, perhaps for the first time in years, what he was doing and who it served. He had walked away. He had returned the money. He had spent the following year taking only bounty work, legitimate warrants, men who were actually wanted and actually dangerous. He had been doing that work for 2 years now. It did not undo anything. He knew that. Augusta listened to all of it without looking away. When he finished, she said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what I am before you make any decisions about what this is." She was quiet for a moment. "What decisions are you expecting me to make?" He looked at her. She had never seen his face so undefended. "Whether you want me to stay." The word stayed in the kitchen like something solid. Augusta thought about the 7 days of fighting for her house. She thought about the porch step he had fixed without being asked. She thought about the way he sat with Lily's fever, unable to leave, unable to help, and how much that inability to leave meant. She thought about his voice reading a fairy story. She thought about the dark past, the real one, the actual weight of what he had carried and done. She did not minimize it. She looked at it clearly and she thought about whether she could hold it alongside everything else she knew about him. She found that she could. "I want you to stay," she said. He was very still. "I think you should be honest with me always," she continued. "And I think there are things you will need to do differently, not because I'm requiring it, but because you already know they need to be different. And I think Lily needs someone who stays, which means you need to decide if staying is something you can do." Oliver was quiet for a long moment. "I have been trying to figure out how to be someone who stays for a long time. I'm not entirely sure I know how yet." "That's honest," Augusta said. "I'm trying to be." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way he had done for her, briefly and with intention. "Then that's enough to begin with." The autumn came in fast after that, the way Kansas autumns do, cold fronts sweeping down from the north with a decisiveness that always surprised people who had arrived in summer. The boarding house filled as the cattle season wound down. 2 new tenants, a land surveyor and a former schoolteacher looking for work, and Augusta had her hands full and her mind full, and her heart full in ways that were entirely different from each other and all equally demanding. Oliver stayed. He reorganized his bounty work to keep him in Caldwell or within a day's ride, which required some negotiation with the deputy marshal who contracted him, but which was, apparently, manageable. He was gone sometimes for 3 or 4 days at a stretch, and those times were uncomfortable in ways Augusta had not anticipated. Not fear exactly, though that was present, but the particular wrongness of the house without him in it. The absence of the quiet, competent presence that had become, without her fully registering it, structural. He always came back. That was the thing. He always came back, and he always told her where he had been and what had happened with a directness that was its own form of intimacy, the decision to be knowable to her, the deliberate opposite of secrets. Lily thrived. This was perhaps the thing that moved Augusta most of all, watching Lily thrive. The child had been quiet and careful when she arrived, had carried herself with a watchfulness that was heartbreaking in something so small, and over the weeks she had slowly uncurled from that watchfulness as the house proved itself trustworthy. She had attached to Augusta with a completeness that made Augusta simultaneously terrified and grateful beyond words. She called her Augusta and she called Oliver Oliver, which was apparently what she had always called him, and she moved between them with a naturalness that looked, from the outside, exactly like what it increasingly felt like from the inside. It was the schoolteacher tenant, a woman named Mrs. Halford, who said it first and out loud, coming into the kitchen one morning to find the 3 of them at the table, Lily working on her letters with Augusta's help while Oliver read the Territorial Gazette and occasionally offered a comment. "You make a lovely family," Mrs. Halford said, with the particular warmth of someone stating a pleasant fact. There was a beat of silence. Then Lily said, with the confident authority of 5 years old, "We are a family." Augusta did not look at Oliver. She looked at Lily, and felt the truth of it, felt how it had become true gradually and completely and apparently without requiring anyone's formal permission. Later, Oliver found her in the kitchen alone and said very quietly, "She's not wrong." Augusta looked at him. "No," she agreed, "she isn't." "Augusta," he stopped. He had the look of a man who has decided to say a difficult thing and is experiencing the difficulty of saying it. "I am not a romantic man. I don't have the language for this. I know that. But I know what I want, which is this. This house and this table and you and Lily and the porch in the evenings and whatever the rest of it looks like. I want that more than I have wanted anything in a long time." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. He was looking at her with that open, undefended expression she was learning, the one he could only hold when they were alone, when the armor he carried for the world had come off in the particular safety of her presence. "Ask me then," she said. He reached into his coat pocket, and she saw that he had planned this, or the beginning of it, because he produced a ring that was not elaborate but was very clearly chosen with care, a simple gold band set with a small dark garnet stone the color of the western sky at the end of a red sunset. "Will you marry me?" he said. Augusta Merriweather, who is braver than she knows and more stubborn than anyone has a right to be, and who is the reason I have started to believe that staying is something I can do. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and looked at his face and thought about how none of this was what she had planned when she stepped off the train in Caldwell, Kansas with $14 and a carpet bag and the absolute certainty that she was walking into the worst mistake of her life. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He put the ring on her finger with a steadiness that she suspected was performed, that his hands were not entirely steady, and then he pulled her against him and held her with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and felt, for the first time in years, entirely home. They were married in October of 1882 in the Caldwell Methodist Church on 3rd Street, on a cool, bright morning when the prairie grass had gone gold, and the sky was the specific aching blue that only happens in Kansas in autumn. Augusta wore a dress she had altered herself from a light blue wool she had found at the dry goods store, because she could not afford and did not especially want something elaborate. Oliver wore his good coat, cleaned and pressed, and someone, Augusta suspected Mrs. Halford, had ensured that he had a decent white shirt. Lily was the flower girl. She took this role with absolute seriousness, scattering dried wildflower petals in the aisle with the precision of someone who had rehearsed, which she had, extensively in the boarding house parlor for 3 days prior. She was wearing a white dress Augusta had made her, and Clover the rabbit was tucked under her arm because there had been no negotiating on that point. The marshal attended. The county solicitor Farwell attended. Mrs. Halford and Plotz and the land surveyor attended. Half of Caldwell attended, which was perhaps not surprising given that the town had been following this particular story for weeks, having formed their own opinions about it since the night they had stood outside the boarding house window and heard Oliver Finley read a bedtime story. The ceremony was brief and sincere. Augusta held Oliver's hands at the altar and looked at his face and said her vows in a clear voice, not performing them but meaning each word with the specific weight of someone who had made a promise before that had gone wrong and had decided, this time, to hold nothing back. Oliver said his vows quietly, the way he did everything, each word placed with deliberate care. He was looking at her the entire time with those careful green eyes, and she could see in them what he could not say in ceremony language, which was everything, which was the whole enormous fact of what this meant to him. When the preacher declared them married, Lily said from the front pew in a stage whisper that the entire church heard clearly, "Finally." There was a ripple of laughter, warm and complete. Oliver smiled. It was a full smile, unhurried and unguarded, and Augusta saw the room react to it the way you react to something unexpected and beautiful. She thought she heard Mrs. Halford make a small sound. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They stayed in Caldwell through the winter, and the boarding house became something that had never quite existed before in Augusta's experience, a place that was simultaneously a business and genuinely a home, with the texture and rhythm of a life being built rather than merely managed. Oliver had a study of the world that Augusta found endlessly useful, not just in the practical matters of running a business in a frontier town, but in the larger understanding of how people worked and what they needed and where the dangerous places were. He was teaching himself to stay, and she was watching him do it, and it was one of the more remarkable things she had witnessed. He caught himself sometimes with the instinct to withdraw, to put distance between himself and anything that had gotten too close or too comfortable, and each time she watched him recognize the instinct and choose differently, and she understood that it cost him something, and she tried to make the choice worth what it cost. She was teaching herself things too. She was teaching herself to ask for help, to say when she was afraid, to let someone else carry part of the weight that she had spent years insisting was hers alone. It turned out that these things were also hard and also had to be chosen deliberately, and that Oliver understood this about her with a precision that suggested he had been paying very close attention. They helped each other. That was the simple version of it. The longer version was every conversation and every evening on the porch and every meal at the kitchen table and every night lying awake listening to the prairie wind and talking in the dark about everything and nothing, the way people talk when they have found someone safe enough to be entirely honest with. In January, Augusta discovered she was pregnant. She told Oliver in the kitchen early morning while he was drinking coffee and reading. She set a cup in front of him and then said very simply that she believed they were going to have a child in the summer. He set down his coffee. He looked at her. And then Oliver Finley did something Augusta had never seen him do in the 5 months she had known him. He put his face in his hands and breathed for a long moment, and when he looked up again his eyes were bright and he said, "Are you well?" "Are you all right?" "I'm very well," she said. He stood up and held her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression she could not find adequate words for, joy and something beyond it, some kind of enormous gratitude aimed at the universe in general. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He kissed her temple and held her, and she could feel him working to contain the size of his feeling, to not be overwhelmed by it. And she thought about what it meant for a man who had spent years shutting himself away to find himself this full of something good. "Happy?" she asked. "I don't have a word for what I am," he said, into her hair. She laughed. "Happy will do." Lily, when she was told, received the information with a gravity that suggested she was processing its significant implications. Then she said, "Will the baby like Clover?" "Very much, I expect," Augusta said. Lily appeared satisfied with this and returned to her breakfast, and then looked up once more to say, with a look of someone who has made a decision, "I'll teach them everything." Spring came, and with it the cattle trade and the particular energy of Caldwell waking from its winter quietness. Oliver had been in conversation with the deputy marshal through the winter about formalizing his arrangement, and in March he accepted a position as a deputy marshal himself, official and contracted, which was different from bounty work in ways that mattered to him and were, Augusta knew, part of the deliberate construction of who he was becoming. He was good at it. He was efficient and measured, and people quickly learned that he was not someone to fool with, while also, slowly, learning that he was not someone who was interested in unnecessary conflict. He kept the peace on Main Street with a minimum of drama, which was not entirely expected from a man with his history, and which, Augusta gathered, made the marshal very happy. Augusta, who was running a fully occupied boarding house while approximately 5 months pregnant and managing a 5-year-old with opinions, was not experiencing spring as an entirely peaceful season, but she was experiencing it as a full one, which was a different thing and considerably preferable. Mrs. Halford, who had become a genuine friend and who had taken a position teaching at the small Caldwell school, was an extraordinary help with Lily, taking her to school each morning and developing with her a relationship that was, in Lily's taxonomy, something between teacher and honorary aunt. Lily was learning to read with the focused intensity she brought to everything, and each new word was reported to Augusta and Oliver at supper with a pride that was entirely justified. There was a day in May when Oliver came home from his duties to find Augusta sitting in the parlor with her feet up, which she did not ordinarily permit herself, reading a letter from her sister in Cincinnati who was apparently healthy and happily married, and sending her congratulations on the baby. Oliver sat across from her and looked at her with that quiet attention. "You look tired," he said. "I'm perfectly fine," she said, with the reflex of someone who has said this on automatic for years. He raised an eyebrow very slightly. She set the letter down. "I'm a little tired," she admitted. The Plotz situation is still complicated, because Plotz had recently become interested in a widow on the east side of town and was coming home at irregular hours, not drunk anymore, which was progress, but noisy, which was its own problem. And Mrs. Halford needs new textbooks for the school, and I said I would help her write the request to the county, and the second-floor hallway needs new boards replaced because the winter was hard on it, and I have not worked out how to do that while also being, she gestured at herself. Oliver stood up. He came and sat beside her on the settee and said, "Tell me which one to start with." She looked at him. She thought about how strange it still felt sometimes to have someone next to her who genuinely meant it, who was not going to offer to help and then disappear before the help was needed. "The hallway boards," she said, "because the surveyor has been complaining. I'll do it Saturday. I can write the letter for Mrs. Halford tonight," she continued. "Write the letter, leave the boards. Oliver, you have to leave me something to do," he said. "Otherwise I feel like cargo." She laughed, which she had not expected to do, and he smiled at her with that particular private smile, the one that was just for her, and she settled back against his shoulder because it was there, and because she had finally, mostly, learned to let herself use it. He fixed the hallway boards on Saturday. He did it in the morning before his patrol and was back at noon for the midday meal. And Augusta had the letter to the county finished, and Lily had helped by sitting next to Augusta and drawing pictures of what she thought the new textbooks should look like, which were very imaginative and would not be included with the letter but were greatly appreciated. The summer arrived with the heat and the cattle and the noise, and in July, Augusta gave birth to a boy. He was born in the upstairs bedroom of the boarding house, attended by the local physician Dr. Granville and by Mrs. Halford, who had volunteered and who turned out to be remarkably composed under pressure. Oliver was in the hallway for the duration, which was several hours, and Augusta could hear him occasionally moving, the sound of his boots on the floorboards, a pacing that he probably did not know he was doing. When Dr. Granville came out to say that Augusta and the baby were both well, Oliver was still for a long moment and then said, "Can I come in?" And the doctor stepped aside. He came in and saw Augusta in the bed, exhausted and radiant in the particular way of a woman who has just done the hardest thing and knows it, holding a small wrapped bundle. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and Augusta turned the bundle toward him and let him see the face. The baby had been in the world for approximately 20 minutes and had Oliver's nose and Augusta's stubborn chin, and was, in all objective assessments, perfect. Oliver looked at him for a long moment. He reached out and touched the baby's cheek with one finger, that same careful, asking quality he brought to the most important moments. "What do you want to call him?" Oliver said. Augusta had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it for months, but the specific rightness of what she wanted to say had only come to her in the last hours. "James," she said. "After your sister's middle name was Jane, it's the nearest I could come." Oliver went very still. "If that's all right," Augusta added. He looked at her and she saw it all move through his face, the grief and the gratitude and the love, all of it at once, not contained this time, not held back. "That's more than all right," he said. He held James for the first time with the same deliberate carefulness he held everything precious, and Augusta watched him holding their son and felt the fullness of it, felt how much ground they had covered to arrive at this room, this moment, this exact configuration of people who had found each other in the unlikely way of the frontier, where the landscape was so unforgiving, and the distances so enormous that the small warmths of human connection burned all the brighter for the contrast. Lily met James the following morning, presented to him with some ceremony in Augusta's bedroom. She examined him with extreme thoroughness. She pronounced him acceptable. She placed Clover the rabbit next to him on the bed for a formal introduction, and explained to him, in a serious and instructional tone, that Clover was very important and he should know this from the beginning. James slept through all of it. Lily announced that this was fine because he would understand later. The autumn of 1883 was the fullest season of Augusta's life in all the ways that mattered. The boarding house ran well, she had a system now, and the two long-term tenants who remained were the least troublesome men in Caldwell, and Mrs. Halford had decided to stay permanently in Caldwell rather than move on, which pleased everyone including the town's children. Oliver had proven, to the considerable surprise of everyone who had known his history, to be a deputy marshal of unusual quality, not because he was the most aggressive enforcer, but because he understood violence, and its consequences well enough to prevent a great deal of it before it required enforcement. He was trusted in Caldwell, which was different from being feared, and the difference was one he had worked for. There were evenings in that autumn that Augusta would hold in her memory for the rest of her life, with particular clarity. Evenings on the porch when James was asleep, and Lily was allowed to stay up a little past her usual hour because the weather was so fine, and the four of them were on the porch with the wide Kansas sky turning from amber to purple to dark, and Lily asked questions about the stars and Augusta answered what she knew, and Oliver added what he had learned from his months on the cattle trails, which was more than he had let on previously. And James slept in Augusta's arms with the untroubled weight of the very young. On one such evening, Lily said, out of the quality of quietness that preceded her more serious questions, "Were you sad before, both of you?" Augusta and Oliver exchanged a look over her head. "Sometimes," Augusta said honestly. "Why, we were both missing things we needed," Augusta said, "before we found them." Lily considered this. "What were you missing?" "Each other," Oliver said, which was so uncharacteristically direct that Augusta turned to look at him and found him looking back at her with that open face, the unguarded one. Lily seemed satisfied with this answer. She looked at the sky. "I was missing you too," she said, in the tone of someone making a related point. "When I was in the territory and you were far away, Oliver, I was missing you." Oliver reached out and smoothed Lily's hair in a gesture of such unforced tenderness that Augusta had to look away for a moment toward the dark prairie. "I know," he said. "I was missing you too. I should have done something about it sooner." "You are doing something about it now," Lily said, with the logic of a child who lives entirely in the present tense. "Yes," Oliver said. "I am." Augusta leaned her head against Oliver's shoulder and felt the warmth of his arm come around her. And James made a small sound in his sleep, and Lily identified the North Star and said its name with pride, and Augusta thought about $14 and a carpetbag and a list of house rules and how the most extraordinary things begin, sometimes, with entirely ordinary objects. In the winter of 1883, Oliver did something Augusta did not expect. He asked her one evening to teach him to read better. He could read adequately, had read the fairy story to Lily, had read documents and correspondences and the Territorial Gazette. But he had, he said, always read slowly and with more difficulty than he wished, had learned piecemeal and without proper schooling, and watching Lily learn with Mrs. Halford had given him, he said, a desire to do it properly. Augusta did not laugh because it was not a funny request. She understood what it cost him to make it. She agreed immediately, and they began in the evenings after supper, working through text with the same care and patience she used with Lily, and Oliver applied to it the same focused intelligence he applied to everything, and improved with a speed that surprised even him. He read to James and Lily after that with increasing fluency and evident pleasure, and Augusta would sometimes sit in the doorway of the children's room and listen to his voice moving through a story, that same voice that had broken Caldwell's heart 6 months before, and she felt its effect on her unchanged, felt it move through her like warmth, felt how extraordinary it was that this voice existed, that this man existed, that she had had the particular fortune to be the one who found the room behind the ordinary one. Spring returned, and with it news from the county that the region was going to get its first dedicated courthouse, a development that Oliver, as deputy marshal, had some involvement in organizing. He came home with the news one afternoon, and Augusta saw in his face a specific pride, the pride of a man who was building something legitimate, something that would outlast him, something he could point to as evidence of the direction he was traveling. She kissed him in the doorway. He looked surprised for a moment and then decidedly not surprised. "What was that for?" he asked. "You look happy," she said. He thought about this for a moment with the characteristic precision he brought to all assessments. "I am," he said, with the conviction of someone who has checked the evidence carefully and found it conclusive. "I am genuinely happy. I wasn't sure I knew how. You're learning, she said. I have a good teacher, he said, and pulled her back for another kiss. And Lily, who appeared from the kitchen at this moment, made a sound of profound disgust and went back to her cornbread, and Augusta laughed against Oliver's mouth. James took his first steps in April, across the kitchen floor, heading with absolute determination toward Oliver, who was sitting against the far wall. He crossed the entire length of the kitchen in 7 unsteady steps, listing significantly to the left, and arrived at Oliver's knee with the triumphant expression of someone who has conquered substantial territory. Oliver caught him before he could fall and held him up with both hands and said, with enormous solemnity, "Well done, James." James said something that was not quite a word, but that was clearly a positive and confident statement about his own capabilities. Lily, who had been watching from the table with the focused attention of a sporting event, said, 7 steps, and immediately began explaining to James that she had managed 9 steps her first time, which Augusta felt fairly certain she was not actually remembering, but which James accepted with complete equanimity. Augusta had her hand over her heart and was trying not to make the sound she was making, which was something between a laugh and a sob, which was the sound that this family had started producing from her on a regular basis, the sound of being more full than you had room for. Oliver looked up at her over James's head and smiled, and she thought about the first time she had seen anything like a smile on his face, that first night in the upstairs hallway when she had handed him a list of rules and he had almost smiled at her stubbornness, and how far that almost smile had traveled to arrive at this one, this full and certain and completely unguarded smile. She had been right to knock on his door. She had been right to stay. She had been right to trust the thing she felt, even when it was inconvenient and complicated and arrived at the worst possible time, and in the person of a man that everyone in Caldwell had decided was heartless. He was not heartless. He had always had the heart. He had simply been keeping it somewhere safe until someone was careful enough to be trusted with it. In the summer of 1884, Lily started a reading group at the school with Mrs. Halford's encouragement for the children whose families did not have access to books. It was not a formal program, just Lily and a handful of other children sitting in the schoolroom on Saturday mornings, taking turns with the books that Lily had accumulated, which were a combination of her own, some donated by Augusta and Oliver, and some sent from Lily's grandmother in Missouri, who had reestablished contact once Oliver and Augusta were settled. The grandmother, whose name was Edna Finley, was a sharp-eyed woman of 60 who had written to them in considerable disbelief about the reports she was receiving of her surviving son being a deputy marshal with a wife and 2 children, and who arrived for a visit in October 1884 to determine the truth of these reports for herself. She arrived on the Santa Fe line, as Augusta had 2 years before, and she looked at the boarding house and at Augusta and at Oliver with the measuring gaze of a woman who had raised a very difficult child and was trying to understand what had happened to him. She stayed for 2 weeks. By the end of the first week, she had appropriated the kitchen for 2 mornings and made more food than anyone could reasonably consume, had read to James until he was asleep in her lap, had engaged Lily in a conversation about botany that revealed Lily had comprehensive opinions about prairie plants, and had sat with Oliver on the back porch for an hour in a conversation that Augusta carefully did not overhear. On the last evening of her visit, she found Augusta in the parlor and sat down with the directness of a woman who has run out of time for indirection. "He wrote to me," Edna said, "after Jane died. He wrote and said he was going to make sure Lily was provided for and that he was sorry he had not done more while Jane was alive. That is the sum total of what I knew about my son for 9 months." She paused. "I want to tell you something." Augusta waited. "I was not always a good mother to that boy," Edna said, in the particular tone of a reckoning that has been arrived at carefully and not recently. "There were hard years. His father was not a kind man, and I did not protect him as well as I should have, And he left at 17 because he needed to, and I knew it and let him go. And I have thought about what he became afterward as something that was at least partly my fault. And then I got your letter and his letter, and I came here, and I see." She paused and looked at Augusta with clear eyes. "He is well. He is genuinely well, and I wanted you to know that I am aware of what you are to him." Augusta looked at her. "What am I to him?" Edna's expression was not soft exactly, but it was warm. "The reason he came home," she said. "Not to a place. He never had one of those, but to himself." Augusta held that statement for a moment. "He found his own way," Augusta said. "I just didn't make him leave." "That," Edna said, "is not a small thing." After Edna left, Oliver found Augusta in the kitchen and could tell from her face that a significant conversation had taken place. "What did she say to you?" he asked. Augusta told him. She watched his face as she told him and saw the complicated movement of it, the old wound, the child who had needed more protection and hadn't gotten it, and the present man who had built something from the wreckage of that, and the particular grace of being seen clearly by a parent and found to be all right after all. "He was quiet for a long time." "She said that to you," he said. "She did." He was quiet again. Then, "My mother and I have a long way to go." "Yes," Augusta said, "but you have time." He looked at her. "Because of you." "Because of you," she said. "You did the work." "Augusta, Oliver." She stood up and went to him and put her hands on either side of his face the way he so often held hers, that deliberate attention. "You did the work. I did not make you into anything. You were always this. I just made it safe to be it." He looked at her for a long moment. His hands came up and covered hers. "I love you," he said. He had said it before, had been saying it for the better part of 2 years in the 1,000 ways that love expresses itself in daily life. But he said it now as a statement of specific fact, and Augusta felt it land with all the weight it had carried through everything, through the dark past and the trap and the secrets and the forced choice between who he had been and who he was becoming. "I love you," she said back, with the same weight, the same specific truth. In the autumn of 1885, Augusta discovered she was pregnant again. She told Oliver over breakfast, as she had told him the first time, with the same simple directness. He set his coffee cup down with the same quality of absolute stillness. Then he smiled. He did not put his face in his hands this time. He just smiled, the full and unhurried smile that Caldwell had once found astonishing, and that Augusta had now catalogued as hers, as something that existed in the world because she was in it. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. Lily at the table said, "I knew it," with the air of someone whose intelligence has been confirmed, and James, who was 2.5 and mostly running at full tilt at all times, said "baby," because he had learned the word at some point and deployed it with enthusiasm whenever the situation seemed to call for it. "Yes," Augusta told him, "a baby." James considered this information and returned to his porridge, having apparently filed it appropriately. Augusta's second pregnancy was different from the first, not harder exactly, but fuller in a way that the first had not been, because she was carrying it in a life that was complete, in a house that was warm and busy and full of voices she loved, in the company of a man who noticed when she was tired and fixed things before she had to ask, and whose presence was so thoroughly woven into the fabric of her days that she could no longer clearly remember what the days had felt like without him. She thought, sometimes, about the woman who had stepped off the train in Caldwell with $14 and a carpetbag, the woman who had moved through the world behind glass, doing what was necessary and efficient and not expecting more, the woman who had learned not to need things and called it wisdom. She felt for that woman a specific compassion, the kind you feel for a younger self who was doing the best they could with what they had, who had not yet met the person who would make wanting things safe again. She was glad to be so thoroughly on the other side of that. The baby was born in the summer of 1886 in the same upstairs bedroom, attended by Dr. Granville and Mrs. Halford, and this time with considerably less drama, because Augusta knew what she was doing now and so did everyone around her. She was a girl, small and dark-haired and imperious from the first minute, and Augusta held her and felt the same enormous specific love she had felt with James, unchanged in its quality, simply doubled. Oliver came in and sat beside her and looked at his daughter and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "She looks like she already has opinions." "She does," Augusta agreed. "She'll fit in perfectly." They named her Ruth, because it was a name that meant companion, and because they had both arrived, independently, at the same name when asked to think about it, which felt like its own kind of sign. Lily announced that Ruth was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, which she said with the authority of someone who had also said this about several sunsets and at least 2 prairie dogs. And James patted Ruth's head with extreme gentleness, and then looked up at Augusta with an expression of pure wonder. Oliver held Ruth for the first time with the same careful certainty he had held James, but with something added, with ease, with a man who had learned that he was capable of this and trusted his own capacity for it. He held her and looked at Augusta over her dark head and said nothing and said everything. Augusta thought about a night in 1882 when she had stood in a doorway watching a man, who was supposed to be Heartless, read a bedtime story, in a voice so gentle it had cracked the town of Caldwell, Kansas, in half. She thought about how that moment had been, in retrospect, not an exception but a revelation. Not a crack in the armor but a window through it into what had always been there, waiting for the right circumstances to be seen. She had seen it. She had been, perhaps, the only person in the right place to see it, standing in her own doorway in her own house with her own lamp, present in the specific way that opened a specific thing. She was grateful every day for the sequence of losses that had led her to Caldwell. Grateful for the dead husband and the $14 and the carpet bag, and even for Cutter Hobbs, whose predatory instinct had forced Oliver into her life in a way that proximity alone might not have managed fast enough. She was grateful for Lily, who had arrived at the back door with a cut on her chin and a rabbit named Clover, and had made herself immediately indispensable to both of them. She was grateful for the stars, because knowing their names had given them something to share on the porch in the early days when everything was still uncertain, and the evenings kept providing them with reasons to stay a little longer. She was most grateful, specifically and enormously, that she had knocked on his door with a list of rules. That she had not been deterred by the gun, or the reputation, or the silence. That she had looked at a man everyone had decided was heartless, and had been willing, against all reasonable advice, to wait and see. The waiting had not been long. That was the thing she had not expected, how quickly the truth of him had made itself available to her once she was paying attention. How the man underneath the formidable exterior had been there all along, the man who fixed porch steps and returned plots to his room with quiet efficiency, and watched Augusta with those careful green eyes, and held a child's fever with him when he could not leave and could not help. The man who had read a bedtime story. The man who was, in the autumn of 1886, sitting on the back porch of their boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas, with his daughter on his shoulder and his son asleep against his side, and his ward at his knee naming stars and his wife beside him, her hand in his, the warm weight of their joined life between them. Augusta leaned her head on his shoulder, the one not occupied by Ruth, and felt him turn slightly toward her, the automatic accommodation of a man who had learned the specific geometry of her presence. "North Star," Lily said, pointing. "That's right," Oliver said. "It always stays," Lily said. "That's why the travelers use it." "That's right," Oliver said again, and Augusta heard in his voice the thing she had learned to hear there, the specific warmth he brought to Lily's observations, the way he gave them weight. "Are we travelers?" Lily asked. It was a real question, the kind she asked when she was working something out. Oliver was quiet for a moment. "We were," he said. "We're not anymore." Lily looked up at the star. "Because we found it, the fixed point." "Yes," Oliver said. "We found it." Augusta closed her eyes and listened to the prairie wind moving through the grass and James breathing in his sleep, and Ruth making the small sounds of a baby who is perfectly content, and Lily asking one more question, always one more, and Oliver answering it, patient and sure. They had found it. Both of them, the travelers that they had been, the ones who had not known for a long time that they were traveling toward anything at all. They had found it in each other, in a boarding house on 2nd Street in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, over a list of house rules and a gold coin and a cup of black coffee, and eventually, finally, over a worn fairy story read in a voice so gentle it had stopped a whole town's breathing. The North Star held its place in the wide Kansas sky, patient and unchanged, and below it, the Finley family kept their porch and their warmth and their considerable noise, and the prairie stretched away in all directions, enormous and unconcerned, and the light from the boarding house windows fell across the dark boards and out into the evening and stayed there, visible from a distance, the specific light of a home that is genuinely inhabited, that has been fought for and chosen, and built deliberately by people who knew what it cost and paid it anyway. Augusta Finley, born Augusta Merriweather, sat with her husband and her children in the last warm evening of the season, and held the fullness of her life like something she had earned and been given in equal measure, and was, in the complete and specific way that only arrives after you have been for a long time without it, happy. Oliver turned his head and looked at her, and she felt the look before she opened her eyes, felt its particular quality of attention, that steady, unguarded seeing that was hers and only hers. She opened her eyes. He was looking at her with the face she knew best, the one that had taken months to earn and that he now gave freely, the one behind all the others. She smiled at him. He smiled back. And the boarding house held them, and the town held the boarding house, and the prairie held the town, and the sky held everything, and the North Star held its fixed and faithful place above it all, exactly where it had always been, exactly where it would always be, the one point in all that dark and distance that never moved, that could always be found again, no matter how far you had traveled or how long you had been lost.